Hello and welcome to today's video on English Language Learners, or ELLs. We're going to start out with some national demographics. With our national demographics, the 2015 report by the National Center for Educational Statistics found that U.S. public school ELL students in 2015 was 9.5% of the total school population, or in individual numbers, that's 4.8 million students. This number has increased quite a bit because if you look at fall of 2000, it was only 8.1% of the total school population, or 3.8 million students. So we've gone up almost a million students just in 15 years. Now the next set of demographics that's interesting is in 2014-15, some 665,000 English language learners or students were also identified as students with disabilities. ELL student with disabilities represented 13.8% of the total ELL population enrolled in U.S. public and elementary schools. So when you think about students with disabilities and English language learners, it's very important to consider that there can be cases of over-identification or under-identification. Over-identification is when people, due to language issues, think that a child has a disability and they're placed in a special program. Or you can have underrepresentation, where people working with English language learners would say, I don't want to place them in special education because it may not be a disability, it may be a language issue. So we need to be careful that students are being placed, or English language learners particularly, are being placed in this program for the appropriate reasons, not being under or over-identified. So here you can see a state map. And if you think about Kansas, when I first came here 20 plus years ago, I did not think there was a lot of diversity in Kansas, but as you can see from this map, Kansas is one of the fastest growing states when it comes to diversity. We are right there with California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Texas, Alaska, and we have one of the highest populations, or the fastest growing populations, when it comes to English language learners. So it's very important to think about how you're going to prepare to address the needs of these English language learners. And a lot of times when I think about English language learners, we think that they are just Spanish speakers. But let's take a look at some more demographic information. So what languages do you think are most spoken by ELL students in the U.S.? Take a minute to think about that. If you guess Spanish, you are definitely right, but can you think of other languages that are spoken by ELL students in the U.S. and rank of, after Spanish, what would you think would be the most common language spoken across the country? I'm going to give you a minute to jot down some ideas of what languages you think. Go ahead and pause the video here, and then we'll come back and see how close you were. Try and at least identify 5 more languages that are spoken by ELL students in the United States. Okay, hope you've come back now. We're going to look at this chart by the National Center for Education Statistics, the condition of education. We can see that Spanish or Castilian is the most dominant language, home language of English language learners, but we also have Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, English too, which is like a combination of English and other languages, and then Somali, Hmong, Russian, Haitian Creole, Tagalog, and Korean. So as you can see, these numbers are pretty dramatic, pretty different, but I'm hoping you got a few of these different languages on the list I asked you to make. All right, so these are some U.S. demographics kind of across the whole country. We're going to switch now and look at some Kansas demographics. So if we look at Kansas in 1990-1991, we had less than 5,000 students. Now from the map you saw, we know that we're one of the fastest growing states, so let's go ahead and jump ahead to 2001, and we see that we had 18,672 students identified as English language learners. But if we jump to 2017, 2018, what do you think that number is? Since we know we're going fast, do you think it doubled, or what was that number? Go ahead and think for a minute and jot down a number. Make a guess. How many do we have in 2017? Okay, hopefully you have your number down, and hopefully you were close to this, because it's actually 45,874 students in 2017-18. So you can see that number more than tripled from our first example, and then again more than doubled from our second example. So, which clearly illustrates why we are one of the fastest growing states when it comes to this population. The ELL students in Kansas, a lot of times we think of them as just migrants or immigrants. Migrants being those people who come for work seasonally but don't stay longer than usually like 6 months. Immigrants are people who come from other countries. Refugees are also some of the population of English language learners in this country. We also have international adoptees. That would be my daughter. She is adopted from Guatemala, so she falls into this category. And then U.S. citizens. What you might be surprised to find is that U.S. citizens are actually the largest population of English language learners in Kansas and actually in the country. A lot of times we think of these students as just coming from other countries, they're just learning a language, but a lot of them can be children who are born here, their parents are born here, maybe even grandparents are born here, so first, second, or third generation. Second or third generation. So we really need to think about the fact that these students aren't just coming from other countries. They are actually born and raised in the United States and are full U.S. citizens. So some of the languages spoken by ELL students in Kansas, this first side where it talks about Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, some of these languages you can see mirror those that were across the country. But in Kansas, we also have additional languages like Tagalog, Khmer, Urdu, even American Sign Language is considered a language, Farsi, Portuguese, Nepali, Dinka, all these different languages. Do you think it is appropriate for an ESL teacher or even a grade level classroom teacher to be expected to know all these languages? Hopefully you would say no, because it's pretty impossible to learn that many languages. And in fact, if we look at our next slide, we know that we have over 45,000 students in Kansas. But among those students, there were over 132 different first languages. Of course, Spanish still is most common, but as a teacher, you cannot necessarily even imagine beginning to learn 132 different first languages. So yes, being able to speak like Spanish or another language is beneficial, but it's not going to make you the most effective teacher of English language learners. You can do that being a monolingual English speaker. A couple other things about English language learners, because that third bullet, we know that they often perform significantly below other students, and that is very evident in standardized tests. About 3/4 of ELS students are also free and reduced lunch students, so we see that overlap again with poverty. And then finally, one thing that I think is critical to take away from this is that state and federal law requires districts to provide language services, or English as a second language, English to speakers of other languages, that's what ESOL stands for, to students who aren't proficient in English. So say you're from a very small district in Kansas and you haven't had any English language learners, which would kind of be surprising. But say in this small district, an English language learner comes in. They're tested and identified as English language learners. By law, you have to provide a teacher who has an ESL certification to work with that student. It may just be like one day a week to pull them out and support them, but they have to have a teacher who is certified to support them. That is the law. In districts that are larger, you may have, one ESL teacher per school. Kind of those smaller districts, you might have, depending on the population, one teacher might visit 2 schools to kind of support the languages there. It just very much depends on the different programs and populations. So speaking of programs, there are a couple of key programs I want to point out. There's ESL Pull-Out. That's where the child is taken out of the classroom to get support from an ESL teacher. There's Sheltered Instruction, which typically is done in the classroom with the teacher who's trained or has a certification in ESL to work with students. And these are typically monolingual English-speaking teachers, but very effective approaches to sheltered instruction. And then we have dual language program models. There's lots of different models. There's transitional models where you start in the native language and move into English. There's maintenance models where you might teach a few years in the native language and then move into English. But the most common dual language program model is a 50-50 model. And that is where you have 50% of your students are native speakers of one language, for example, Spanish, and the other 50% should be monolingual English speakers. In this type of situation, it's really important to get buy-in from not only the Spanish-speaking or native language-speaking population that you want to do the program with, but also the community who is English language dominant, because a lot of the times parents might feel if they put their children into this program, they're going to get behind because they're learning another language, but they're actually in the end going to be more successful because they have now two languages to take with them. A 50-50 model is something that goes throughout your schooling. You can also have a 90-10 model where you might start out in kindergarten with 90% of the instruction in Spanish and then move 10% into English. That's for kindergarten. And then in first grade, you go to 20-80. So again, 80% of the instruction is in Spanish, and then it moves to 20% in English. And then it continues to go on so that by the end, in fifth grade, you're going to be in a 50-50 program model. So you're kind of becoming that effective bilingual student. These programs can be a little bit challenging because you need to make sure, as you can see on this next part of the slide, that you have to have specific keys to be successful. First, you have to have a research base, like the dual language program or the ESL pull-out program or the sheltered instruction model have to be in place and follow those research-based methods to make sure they're effective. You have to have qualified teachers. For ESL pull-out and sheltered instruction, this typically just requires a teacher who has an ESL endorsement. But for a dual language program model, you have to have a teacher who is proficient in the native language. So if it's Spanish, Chinese, whatever the dual language program model is, the native language, teachers have to be proficient. And then finally, you have to have the ongoing assessment and evaluation of the program, whichever program is being implemented, to make sure that students' needs are met. One of the ways to do this is through testing. Every year, students are tested to see how their proficiency is moving along in English. But those tests are a standardized test, even though it's a language test. In Kansas, we use the KELPA. These tests can still be challenging for students and not necessarily reflect all of their knowledge. So you want to use caution and make sure you're doing ongoing assessment throughout your own classroom and instruction. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we need to think about when working with these students. So we have a model here. It's called the PRISM model, and its emphasis what we call biography-driven instruction. That biography, as you can see, it's bolded and emphasized, is all about getting to know your students. And think about this, for example, if I were to give you a scenario. Say you are a child from, China, and you were born and raised in the United States, but your parents are from China. So you're a native citizen, your parents speak to you mostly in Chinese. So you get into school and the teacher's main focus is to right away get you speaking English. So they emphasize language. Think about that language being like a ball that you're going to juggle. So you're having to juggle that language throughout the day, trying to understand and learn what's happening in English. Then you have to think about the academic content you have to learn as well. So not only are you trying to develop the language, you're trying to understand the content of the classroom. So think about getting another ball. Now you have two balls to juggle as a student, that language development and the academic development. Then you move to the cognitive. I'll give you a third ball. This is where you have to process information. This is where you might take in something in English, translate in your head in Spanish or the native language, and then put it back out in English. So it's that cognitive process of how you know, think, and apply information. So now you're juggling three balls as a language learner, trying to manage all this within the school setting. And then you're also then with your own home life and community. So that's the sociocultural and probably the heart of this PRISM, because it's so important to get to know what is influencing our children in the home. Do they have support? What is their life like? How do they laugh? Who do they love? So the sociocultural would be like the fourth ball if you have to juggle something. So consider my little image here. You know, you're Mickey and you're trying to juggle all these balls. If you're a child trying to juggle all these balls, what's going to happen? Most likely you're going to drop one, more, two, or three. You might just be frozen with that first one. So you have to consider that students are doing a lot when acquiring that second language. And by not considering all four of these dimensions, we're doing them a disservice. We need to look at the whole biography in order to best meet the needs of our students. So that's what biography-driven instruction is all about. So kind of to give you an idea of how we might address the distinct needs of students, I'm going to give you another scenario to think about. So for example, we are going to, if I were to ask you to tell a chain story, what is a chain story? Well, kind of from our image here, it's like people are going to link together, but it's actually people just standing or in a group and they are telling a story. One person starts the story and then the next person takes over and the next person takes over and so on until the story is finished. So that's a chain story. So I want you to think about a topic that you're very comfortable with. If you have someone at home who can do this activity with you, that would be even better. But for example, you may talk about like K-State. So my first student would start out talking about K-State and what they know. Like they're in the College of Education. K-State is a great school, wonderful professors. That's how the first person might start. Then the second person would take over and say, yeah, I really like this professor. Dr. Perez is the best because she's really engaged and really wants to make sure we're successful. And then the third person would take over. A third person would say, yeah, I agree. Dr. Perez is the best. I've learned so much from her, and I want to continue to take classes. I want to continue taking classes from her forever. And then the fourth person might come in and say, yeah, Dr. Perez is great, and I'm so glad I took this class. Block B rocks. Okay, so each person is added to the story. Of course, you saw the main theme there. Dr. Perez is great. So let's think about a story like that. If we link it back to our PRISM model and that biography-driven instruction, socioculturally, if you had to tell a story about that, it'd probably be pretty easy, and especially when you're singing the praises of your professor. You would have prior knowledge about it because you're all involved in the course and at K-State, and then you'd probably be able to make personal connections knowing, what a great professor I am. And you want to be a future teacher like that and be as good. So socioculturally, you probably found this a pretty easy task to do. When it comes to language production, since you're just telling a story and building from one person to the next, grammar is usually pretty good. Sentence structures are like beginning, middle, end. It's a good sentence structure. Academically, it's really not a content-based activity if you're talking about something you're familiar with. And I'll talk about CALP and what it means here in just a minute. And then perceived cognitive complexity, how hard was it for you to think of connections or produce information? Again, if you're working with someone and kind of just talking about a story that you're all familiar with, it'd be pretty easy. So now let's go back to this idea of the chain story, and let's change things up a little bit. So think about, that same group of 4 students, and now they're going to tell another story about photosynthesis. But as they tell the story, they are not allowed to use any letters like P, S, L, or T. So think about that. P for photosynthesis, L for light, S for sun, T for this, the, then. So take a minute and just on your own, try and tell me about photosynthesis without using any words that start with those 4 letters. And then imagine you're in a group of 4 and have to do this. How easy or difficult is it? Pause the video and try and tell me about photosynthesis without using P, S, L, or T. Okay, hopefully you kind of tried to do that on your own. I'm assuming this is a challenging task for you, but let's go ahead and debrief the chain story if we were to do it in the second format. So if you had to think about the social cultural factors, it was probably a little bit more stressful to try and come up with words and a story that was comprehensive and made sense about photosynthesis. You may or may not have prior knowledge about the topic. I didn't ask if you knew about photosynthesis, I just assumed you did. And if you are not a science fan, it might have been hard to make personal connections. When it comes to language, if you did this activity yourself, you probably found that grammatically your grammar was not that great because you couldn't use a lot of the words you would normally use to describe photosynthesis, and your sentence structure was probably pretty choppy, didn't have a flow because you couldn't use all those connecting words that started with T. Academically, this is a very content-based activity. You did have to have knowledge of science and the process of photosynthesis to be able to participate. And then finally, the perceived cognitive complexity, you probably thought it was kind of hard to come up with this story without using those 4 letters. So it must have been, or should have been, more challenging for you. So when you think about that, what could you do as a future teacher to help students who are put in a situation like this? They may not have the words or the vocabulary to participate, but they know the content or the concepts. So take a minute again to think about some ways you could do this, and then I'll come back and give you some additional ideas or tips. Pause the video here and write down some ideas. Okay, well hopefully some of the ideas you came up with was possibly a word bank. Having a word bank for students so they could have that supplemental vocabulary if they couldn't use the words with those letters. Other ideas might be to make sure they could talk to each other in a small group. Normally when I do this activity, I don't allow my students to communicate. I also put a pressure on them with their peers watching the storytellers if they do say a word with P, S, L, or T, the group that's observing them goes, so they feel really nervous and their stress level goes up. So allowing them to talk and communicate. Some other suggestions would be maybe to allow them to write or to draw a picture of photosynthesis and explain it that way. There are lots of different ways you can support your students. Make sure they didn't feel pressure. Make sure they had that support. So these are just some tips to think about when working with your students. But even more important, the purpose of this kind of simulation, to do a chain story, one where you're familiar with the topic and one where it's kind of an academic task, is that it demonstrates the difference between BICS and CALP. BICS is what we call our basic interpersonal communication skills. This is what we understand from context. If you're talking about K-State, you would all have a pretty good understanding of that. Acquisition of syntax, grammar, basic vocabulary, it's pretty easy, pretty simple. It's, in layman terms, we call BICS our social language. CALP, on the other hand, is the cognitive academic language proficiency. This is where we get into textbooks and having to read. It's not really contextualized all the time. It may be more of a writing task. It requires more ability to use that second language as a tool for learning. So we call CALP our academic language. And this distinction is critical because a lot of times your English language learners or ELLs will develop the social language first, look fluent because they can talk to their friends, they play on the playground, they can talk to them in the lunchroom. However, they aren't fluent in their language skills because they don't have what we call CALP, that cognitive academic language. So let's look at how long it takes to acquire these skills. So for BICS, that social language takes 2 to 3 years for an ELL student to acquire. CALP, on the other hand, could take up to 5 to 7 years. So you can see here this black line represents the students who are English language learners. They're always trying to catch up to their monolingual English-speaking peers when it comes to academic language. So it's critical that teachers don't mistake the social language for the academic language, which I've heard in situations before where teachers might say, you know, Irina, she speaks Russian at home, but she's doing great in school. She talks all the time to her friends, plays on the playground. She's just lazy. Well, Irina is not lazy. She's actually just struggling with the academic language and needs support in order to be successful. So don't mistake social language for academic language. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some strategies you can do. This is from one of the websites you were asked to look at, Colorín Colorado. These are some good, just differentiated instruction strategies for your English language learners. So first and foremost, get to know as much as possible about each student. You don't want to assume all Spanish speakers are from Mexico. That is not true. So find out about your students and get to know as much as possible about their language and their experiences so you can support them best in the classroom. Have high expectations for all students. Again, you've got to make sure that you are not watering down your curriculum or watering down your tasks. You need to scaffold or shelter the information for your students and make sure you always promote those high expectations. You also want to have a variety of research-based instructional strategies. So there are lots of strategies out there. The website you looked at give lots of great tips, and we also have more in-depth classes that can help you with this here at K-State. You want to use ongoing assessment to guide instruction and provide multiple types of those assessments. So it's not just about the standardized test or the language proficiency test. It's really about the ongoing formative assessment you do within the classroom to support your students and making sure those assessments are not always paper pencil. You know, give them projects, give them activities, give them things to build or do so that way they can show you what it is that they understand without just having to take a paper pencil test. You want to differentiate homework. So say you are sending vocabulary words home or, like spelling words home. And for your regular classroom, you might send 10 words home or for your regular class. But for English language learners, you want to try and identify maybe 5 keywords that are essential for them to know or try and put the words in both English and their native language so that you can differentiate and help them. Different strategies like that are always very effective. Finally, a couple other tips. Collaborate with ESL teachers and peers. When you get into the school, you want to pull on your resources. Your ESL teachers are always great resources, and your colleagues who have worked with EL students before are also very helpful. You want to use flexible grouping. One of the biggest things in order to promote language is to give your English language learners role models. So let them sit with native English speaking peers. Let them work with them so that they can hear the language in use. They can start to pick up on that language. Don't always try and isolate your students and put them, all the ELL students together. You want to intermix them with your monolingual English speakers because that's how they're going to acquire language. And then finally, just make sure that content is comprehensible for all students. You don't want to teach a lesson without using visuals, hands-on, guarded vocabulary, different things like that, because your ELL students might miss key information or content. It's not going to hinder your English speakers to use visuals or hands-on activities. It's going to reinforce the learning for them as well. So please don't shy away from that when working with English language learners. Well, there's so much more I can tell you about this topic. We actually have a whole endorsement or specialization in this area. There are 5 courses that give lots of wonderful information, so if it's something you're interested in, I would definitely recommend at minimum trying to take the methods class because it gives some great strategies and techniques. The assessment class is also very helpful. Culture and language builds some great skills and understanding about different cultures and how that language is acquired, and also the linguistics class gives you an in-depth look at the structure of language and how to support students. And then finally, we have practicum courses. These practicum courses can be done here in the States in your schools across Kansas or in other states. They can also, we also have a study abroad program where you can complete your practicum. For example, this year we're taking a group to Ecuador. Students are going to go to Ecuador and get their practicum there, and then a group is going to Mexico. All right, well, that was a lot of information. I hope it was helpful. For this week, just remember to keep up with your journals, like your prompts. Make sure if you are the one responding, you respond, and make sure if you're giving the critical peer feedback, you do that. Next week, we'll also have on Tuesday a guest instructor to discuss special education. Some of you may have had Dr. Knochenhoffel. If you haven't, she's a wonderful resource and I'm going to give you some really good first-hand information. I'll be traveling on Tuesday, so I will try to zoom into the lesson, record it, and then send it to all of you next week so that you have that lesson. If not, I will make sure to get the PowerPoint information for Dr. Knochenhoffel and have her help me get that uploaded for you. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. It's probably one of the topics that is most dear and near to my heart. Anytime you have additional questions on this topic, please let me know. It's something I love and would really like to talk more about. But given that we need to go week by week, that's about as in-depth as we can get. So have a great week. Remember, you have to turn in your release forms. If you don't have the signatures for those release forms for your Change Agent video project, still put the name and fill out as much of the information as possible and upload those release forms until you get them signed, and then just re-upload the signed release forms. Also, you'll have time next week to start working on that project. So your first interview, oral history, is due April 13th. So you want to make sure you identify people to interview and start getting them lined up and do your first interview. You're going to turn in an uncut version of that interview to me, and then you'll be able to take the edited interview and use that in your final project. At the end of the month, I believe on the 27th of April, you also have to turn in your first lesson plan based on the books. Remember, we are doing 2 books per person, so each group has 4 books. You're going to upload the copies of those lesson plans for the rest of the group to see, and that way we'll have a nice kind of resource bank of materials. All right, I think that's all for now. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll be in touch. Have a great week. Bye.